For those that aren't familiar with the Tao Te Ching, it was allegedly written by someone that we call Lao Tzu. He's thought to be a contemporary of Confucius, but there's, as Brian, I think in particular, will know well from all the different translations that he's read, there is some question over who he was, whether he was one person, and, as there often is with ancient wisdoms, how this was written down. And there's a couple of different versions that put the ordering of the two sort of key books of the Tao Te Ching in different orders. But I think regardless of who he was and whether he was one person or not, there is a lot in the Tao Te Ching that I feel is sort of deep wisdom that is needed for our times. And at the same time, I think there's some very interesting questions about the relevance and the application of this wisdom to our times, given the complexity that we are dealing with. And two questions in particular that I want to call out, one of which actually came up in a very interesting LinkedIn discussion last week, was, are these ancient wisdoms really relevant, or do they need to be rewritten and sort of re-evaluated for our modern times, given the nature of the challenges that we're facing in the world, the urgency of the problems, especially with the Tao, given one of the core elements is this idea of doing by non-doing. Is that really relevant? Or even by asking the question, are we indicating that maybe we don't fully understand what it means to be doing by non-doing? So that's sort of one of the questions I think we can be exploring over the next several weeks. Another one that I've found myself reflecting on quite a lot as I've been reading and reflecting on the Tao recently is, are some of the ideas and concepts really relevant to women and to people of color, given the world that we live in, given the lack of voice that women and people of color often have in organizations? And again, given that this idea of leadership that is embodied in the Tao, which is often one of stepping back and letting people take the credit, feel like they've done the work themselves, right? There's great wisdom in that. And what does that mean for women and people of color in a world where they're already failing to get the recognition they often deserve for the contributions and the work they bring? So difficult questions, but ones that I hope you feel are worth exploring. The other thing that I will say briefly about this topic is, several years ago, I suppose, when I got off the corporate ladder and the corporate train, I started my own journey to discovering flow and discovering kind of a different way of being in the world. One that I wouldn't have said at the time, but I suppose now I'm starting to realize might be slightly more feminine than masculine. And as Stephen Mitchell, who translated sort of one of my favorite versions of the Tao, has said, the wisdom of the Tao, this as a religious text, if you like, is arguably one of the most feminine texts that's out there. And I think that's incredibly interesting for this time that we're living in, where there's really a call for more feminine principles in our world, and especially in leadership and even in business and organizations, and a variety of ways of doing. So I'm sort of putting forward, as you can see, a few different arguments. There's arguments against some of the wisdom of the Tao, but there's also a lot of arguments for the wisdom of the Tao in our times. And the big question for me, and I feel the Tao sheds a lot of light on, is how do we live and work in harmony with life? Because that feels to me as though it's something that we are, as a species, being called to do more and more. But I don't know that most of us even know what that means, right? We're so used to living in our heads and being driven by, our intellects, and driven by this idea of doing and being busy and forcing and pushing. And so a lot of the concepts in the Tao will seem contradictory. They'll seem, not like wisdom, but potentially, things to be challenged in our modern world. And so I hope that we're going to dig deeper in our conversations into some of these topics, and particularly the wisdom in the paradox that we see again and again and again in the Tao. So I won't go too much into what some of those paradoxes are. I know they're going to come up in the conversation, but I hope that gives a little bit of background as to, why I thought a series of conversations would be worth taking some time for.